Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to come and speak about topics that actually matter. Far too often we become fixated on things that are only really relevant on the margins or tangentially related to more important topics. This last week is a good example of that, worrying about who's doing what, where, and when, although that is related. But I'm happy to be here talking about a really pertinent issue, which is U.S. security in the region in South Asia. I'll just say briefly a little bit about what I do. Jen gave me a kind introduction. As she said, I'm a researcher at RAND focusing on insurgency and counterinsurgency, counter-narcotics, and a host of issues in South Asia and elsewhere. More recently, I've been doing a lot of work on Mexico as the situation south of the border heats up. I teach 2 undergrad courses at Pitt, one course on international organized crime in the fall, and then a course on financing terrorism in the spring. And as Jen mentioned, I spent last year, January to April, working as an analyst with Combined Joint Interagency Task Force Shafafiyat, which is the Dari word for transparency. It was an anti-corruption cell under the lead of General H.R. McMaster. And we looked at a variety of issues related to anti-corruption and organized crime in Afghanistan. So here's a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. It's really just different relationships in the region, how the U.S. relates to the various countries and how these countries relate to each other. And this matters not only to the United States, but to the region at large, and to actors not listed on here beyond the region, namely China, Russia, and Iran. So the first relationship I'm going to talk about is the United States and Afghanistan. It's the relationship I know the best, and it's really, for our purposes, at the heart of what we're talking about today. So right there you have Afghan President Hamid Karzai, the most favored son when the U.S. initially went in 2001, has since kind of fallen out of favor, I'd say, in the eyes of many, largely due to the issue of corruption. Not only is Karzai's government thought to be corrupt, but this corruption permeates multiple levels of society. And when you talk to Afghans, there's not necessarily agreement on which kind of corruption is the most pernicious, right? And so there's that high-level corruption at the government level, at the very upper echelons, but that corruption seeps down also to the very local level, to the Afghan National Police, to the Afghan National Army. And so just anecdotally speaking with Afghans, many had the same feeling that a lot of Americans have when I said, what bothers you more? Corruption at Karzai's level, or is it, the corrupt policeman or bureaucrat that wants to charge you an extra $30 to get a license that you're not supposed to be charged for, or that you're supposed to be charged $5 for, and he wants $30. And almost like many Americans, they said, kind of like those guys in Washington, we almost expect a certain level of corruption from the politicians, right? So that's going to go on, and there's very little one can do to stop that. Almost like when you have these scandals in Congress, people just shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know, I kind of expected that was going on. But it's the corruption that affects their daily lives that really, really alienates them, and for all intents and purposes is a driver of forcing folks to support the insurgency. And even if they're not going to support the insurgency outright, they're not going to support the government, right? And so you often hear about this battle for hearts and minds and the popular support of the population. And corruption plays a huge role in this quote-unquote battle for hearts and minds. The U.S. presence post-2014 with the withdrawal of forces is going to change a lot of things. Changes U.S. access in the region, changes certainly the security situation on the ground, how well will ANSAF, the Afghan National Security Forces, to include the Army and the police, be able to operate autonomously or with limited U.S. support. And so few people think that there's going to be a complete U.S. withdrawal in 2014, right? But forces are going to begin to leave, and you're likely to see some sort of light footprint. People often talk of the transition from counterinsurgency to counterterrorism. So trainers, special forces elements that are going to stay behind, and some intel guys that are likely to augment the growing ANSAF presence throughout the country. But we still don't know how capable the Afghan National Security Forces are, especially vis-a-vis the Taliban, which is an enemy that enjoys sanctuary in neighboring Pakistan, that enjoys funding from wealthy donors in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East. And that's not likely to cease anytime soon. In fact, once the U.S. withdraws, many speculate that that funding from the Gulf and from the Middle East is going to ramp up, which makes the prospects of a negotiated settlement that much more important. I was talking with a colleague the other day, and we said, we've been there now for, 10 or 11 years. He said, if you would have told me in 2001, as the United States was preparing to enter Afghanistan, that the best case scenario that we could hope for was bringing the Taliban to the table to try to hammer out a peace deal, I would have told you were crazy. But in fact, isn't that the best of many bad scenarios at this point? I mean, in my mind, that's probably our best option at this point, with several less palatable options to follow. Now, it remains to be seen if that's even possible, right? Is the Taliban willing to negotiate? Who speaks for the Taliban? And that's another thing, is when people say the Taliban, what do they really mean? Is that one homogenous entity? It certainly isn't, right? There's the Afghan Taliban, or the Quetta Taliban, led by Mullah Omar, which is the original core group. But then there's various smaller groups that operate in concert with, some autonomously and are connected to the Taliban, and some claim to be Taliban for various reasons. But there's other groups like the Haqqani Network, Gulbuddin Hekmatir's group, HIG, and then several other groups, not to mention the Pakistani Taliban, which is a completely different group altogether across the border in Pakistan. And so it's a bit murky who we're actually talking about when we say the Taliban. But for the purposes of this presentation, when I say the Taliban, I'm really referring to Mullah Omar's group, the Afghan Taliban, or the Quetta Taliban. And that's the group that the lion's share of efforts to bring to the negotiating table are going to be with. Again, we still don't know at times who we're dealing with. Sometimes there's imposters that claim to be representatives of the Taliban, and they're actually not. There's a host of fake Taliban Twitter accounts, which is something also, if you told me in 2001 that I'd be paying attention to something called Twitter, and that I'd be following fake insurgent groups that are using this as a social media platform, I would have said you're crazy. But things can change. In an era of globalization, things change pretty quickly. So maybe in 2 or 3 years, Twitter will be outdated, and there will be some other platform that people are using to communicate on. But at this point, what we're hoping for essentially is, with this switch from counterinsurgency to counterterrorism, is to keep Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for al-Qaeda once again. Right? I mean, that was the initial stated goal, was to go in and to root out al-Qaeda and to make sure that Afghanistan wasn't used as a platform for terrorists and militants to launch attacks against the West. And I'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation. There was a study done by Paul Cruikshank at the New America Foundation, and he talks about what he calls the militant pipeline and various attempts or plots against the West the West to include the United States, Europe, and where these attacks emanated. And this speaks exactly to this point of safe haven or sanctuary and how groups can use that to plan attacks. And then finally, if the Taliban does decide to strike a deal, what's the nature of their role in the Afghan government? How is that going to change what Afghanistan looks like? Not only in the Pashtun regions where the Taliban is popular, but in Afghanistan as a whole. How is the Taliban likely to relate to the non-Taliban elements in the government? And what does that portend for the future of Afghanistan moving forward? Just this past week, a prominent warlord in Afghanistan essentially made overtures indicating that, okay, it's now the end of 2012. We've got one more year until the U.S. starts packing up, and that could accelerate, we don't know. Let's start getting ready for the inevitable civil war, which many think is likely to happen when that U.S. security footprint is lifted from the region and all sides and ethnic groups start mobilizing. So it's kind of a backtracking to the 90s. Again, that's yet to be seen, but when some of the prominent warlords in the country are voicing this publicly, it's hard to think that that's not a prominent theme for many. So I mentioned the Afghan Taliban. Right here is one of the few pictures of Mullah Omar. You know, the press often depicts him as the shadowy, one-eyed Clarke, or, you know, I kind of put that up there tongue-in-cheek, the elusive one-eyed Clarke. But there's a lot more important characteristics of this gentleman than the fact that he has one eye, right? The most important is what is his outlook on negotiations? Is this a pragmatist that you're dealing with? Is this an ideologue, a hardliner? And there's still very little information known on Mullah Omar's platform and what he thinks about negotiating with the U.S. But this is going to be increasingly important as prospects of negotiation dwindle. So furthermore, how much control does Omar have over the organization? And furthermore, what is his relationship to the Pakistani ISI? Is he acting as a puppet of the ISI? Is he simply enjoying safe haven and protection, but is free to act on his own behalf? Again, because we don't have a very clear picture of that, this is a major question mark. And I'd say it's a major U.S. blind spot as far as moving forward and what we're likely to see post-2014. But Omar, there's one thing that is not in doubt, and that's that Omar does command a loyal following from a large swath of ethnic Pashtuns, not only in the Kandahar region, but throughout southern Afghanistan, to include Helmand province, where the U.S., and in particular the U.S. Marine Corps, is maintaining a still robust but dwindling presence. And so, you know, again, I was talking with a colleague the other day, and he said, I feel like we have more questions now than we did before we went in. And I said, you know, in many respects, that's probably true. But there are a few critical questions that we really need to come closer to finding an answer to before anyone can say with a modicum of certainty how this is likely to play out. And you know, to be frank, we're really just not sure. And the U.S. government and the U.S. military does not deal well in an era of uncertainty, or because they're planners, and you know, there's a lot of planning that goes into conducting these kinds of operations. And when you're dealing with these question marks, it's a major challenge. I also mentioned the Haqqani Network a couple of minutes ago. This is a picture of the kind of the patriarch of the group, Jalaluddin Haqqani. He was a militant commander with a large following during the Soviet-Afghan War, and he's kind of ceded control of the organization now to some of his sons. And for quite a while, I think the U.S. struggled to get a clear picture on exactly, what was this group, the Haqqani Network? Was it really just a part of the Taliban? Was it more a part of Al-Qaeda? And I think over the past few years, we've learned that actually it's really an autonomous group. In fact, in many respects, it's the most violent group. During my stay in Afghanistan, some of the more violent attacks were Haqqani Network attacks. And many have identified this group as the most likely spoiler in any kind of peace process. Officially, they're subsumed under the larger Taliban umbrella, led by Omar. But the Taliban depends on Haqqani, and Haqqani depends on the Taliban, and so there's the symbiotic relationship but there's also a high degree of autonomy for the Haqqani Network. So what are the goals of this group? What are their objectives? What do they want? And that's something also that's interesting to ask. Some scholars speculate that the Haqqani Network is making so much money off of organized crime that this group is very unlikely to negotiate an end to the insurgency and to lay down their weapons. Similar to a group like FARC in Colombia, a group that once started out as a highly ideological Marxist organization and has since, their motivational structure has been changed over time by their involvement in narcotics trafficking. And so guys that joined the group in the 60s and 70s had a completely different reason than the younger generation who's joined with these massive profits coming in through various rackets to include kidnapping, extortion, drug smuggling. And that's going to be a big indication of whether or not this group is likely to play ball, so to speak. Again, they maintain a distinct command and control and lines of operation, and that gives you a hint of what they're capable of and whether or not they would even fold in to a larger negotiated settlement or ceasefire. And furthermore, the connection to the ISI. I think the ISI is happy to use Haqqani as a proxy for their rogue foreign policy, and they look at the Haqqani Network as one of a number of groups, to include the LET and others, as a group that they would quote unquote save for a rainy day. You hear that term pretty often, and what I mean by that is many folks within Pakistan's security establishment see the real fight being between Pakistan and India. A lot of that relating back to Kashmir. And so it actually pays to hold these groups in reserve for the day when that fight comes, to have these guys to use against the Indians. And I'll get into that relationship in just a minute. A bit more on the Haqqani Network. It truly is one of Afghanistan's most experienced and sophisticated insurgent organizations. And you can see this in the types of attacks that the Haqqani Network conducts. The types of weapons that they use: highly disciplined fighters, a fairly mature operational security detail, well-spread intelligence apparatus throughout the country. And most of this emanates from the base across the border in North Waziristan, although they do maintain a significant presence throughout Afghanistan, including in the capital, in Kabul. And as I mentioned, elements within Pakistan's security establishment view the Haqqani Network as a useful ally. So it's not a foregone conclusion that the Pakistanis are going to abandon Haqqani. In fact, in my personal opinion, it's highly unlikely. Again, also, I'd just like to say, anything I say here today is Colin Clarke's personal opinion. I don't represent any organization or institution. These are my own personal thoughts, right or wrong. Finally, the Haqqanis have launched attacks against a number of targets, mostly ISAF, but also against the Indians. The Pakistanis are increasingly concerned about the growing relationship between Afghanistan and India. and they've attacked Indian infrastructure within Afghanistan. So just to give you an idea of how people think about Haqqani, it's been called the most resilient enemy network in AfPak. So this is a group whose foot soldiers, mid-level commanders have been killed. They're constantly on the run, living under the threat of drone strikes. And this group has continued to maintain a fairly high operational tempo of attacks. Again, much of this perpetuated by a reliance on organized crime, various criminal rackets that keeps the group well-funded. And when you're well-funded and you have a safe haven, as an insurgent organization, you're in pretty good shape. We'll talk a little bit now about the relationship between the United States and Pakistan. Again, the biggest sticking point between our frenemy, Pakistan, right? Because we have this relationship where we meet, our leaders meet, and they do the photo ops, and there's high level of reliance in certain areas, but then there's also this antagonistic relationship with the ISI and other commanders that blatantly offer sanctuary and protection to the Taliban and other insurgent groups. At the end of the day, there's very little the U.S. can do about that. TTP, which I'll get into in a minute, is the Pakistani Taliban. And I say Frankenstein's monster there because at one point the Pakistani Taliban was under the control of the Pakistani security establishment and has since turned against the Pakistanis. And now the Pakistani government and security forces fight this insurgency within their own borders, which is an interesting development. There's a lack of trust, quite frankly, between the U.S. and Pakistan for numerous reasons, but this lack of trust was exacerbated after it was found that Osama bin Laden had been living and hiding out in Abbottabad, pretty close to, bless you, Pakistan's equivalent of West Point. And so folks are highly skeptical that the world's most wanted man could be living within the country, and that the upper echelon of Pakistan's government and security forces would have no idea that he was there. You could see in the details that have been released about the raid that President Obama refused to share information with the Pakistanis that the United States was going to conduct this raid for fear that the Pakistanis would then tip off bin Laden and he would elude capture once again. And although that whole story has kind of died down and receded from the headlines, it's still a major, major issue between the U.S. and Pakistan, and one not likely to be resolved anytime soon. And finally, I mean, let's not forget that Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state. A lot of people are labeling it a failed state or a failing state, so it's on the verge of state collapse. I wouldn't go that far myself, but again, if you think about all the bad things and all the bad scenarios out there in the world, this is right up at the top. This is something that not many things keep me up at night. This is one of them. Playing out various scenarios in my head. Definitely at the top of the list. Tehrike Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, many of the group's leaders have been active inside Afghanistan since the Soviet-Afghan War. So this is a fairly dispersed network on both sides of the border, but largely concentrated within Pakistan itself. Pakistan's Ahmadzai Wazir tribe offered shelter to Al-Qaeda fighters, Al-Qaeda fighters and Taliban fleeing the U.S. invasion in 2001. And it took a few years for this group to really congeal and get its own brand out there to say, we're this separate group from Al-Qaeda. We're not Al-Qaeda. We're not the Afghan Taliban. This is who we are. And, and I mentioned a minute ago that Haqqani Network was the most resilient group. This is a highly resilient group that's been targeted with drone strikes. A number of its leaders have been killed, and the group continues to maintain a wide level of popular support within the federally administered tribal areas, and particularly within North and South Waziristan, kind of the popularly referred to as the no man's land or the Wild West, or an ungoverned area, whatever you want to call it. I'd argue that the area is not ungoverned at all. It's governed, it's just not governed by people that we necessarily like, or so I'd say it's more aptly described as alternatively governed. There's a level of governance or government there, but it's just maybe at a subnational level and according to different rules of the game than we're used to operating with. United States and India, this is an extremely important relationship, especially as India becomes more pronounced on the world scene. This is seen as a rising power in the world. A lot of people talk about the BRIC countries, but India is a rising power in many ways beyond its economy. And the United States has a growing relationship with India, especially as it pertains to security. And this is reflected across the board, but if you'll see growing cooperation between the US Navy and the Indian Navy. Why is this? Why India? Well, in my opinion, I think the US views India as a bulwark against Chinese power and growing Chinese expansion in the region, in Asia. A lot of you have probably heard about the pivot to Asia, US foreign policy, this kind of, okay, we're disengaging a bit from the Middle East, which, I'm not sure is wise at following the Arab uprising and continued strife between Palestinians and Israelis. But we're shifting our focus to Asia, right? There's this pivot to Asia with an eye on the Chinese and the North Koreans and others. But India is seen as a partner and a close partner for the United States in this respect. There was the 2005 US-India nuclear deal, which brought the US and India closer. But then again, there's that relationship that we just talked about, the US and Pakistan, right? And the Pakistanis view everything as a zero-sum game. So even if the Pakistanis have a positive net gain, right? If something like this happens, the 2005 US-India nuclear deal, it's not the Pakistanis gain in their own area and the Indians gain in their own area. That's a net negative for the Pakistanis, right? Any Indian positive is viewed as a negative in Pakistan. And they also complain quite often of a double standard. Why are the Indians allowed to do this? And if the Pakistanis do it, people cry foul. But I think along with this growing cooperation, there's been a shared conception of the threat. 2008, the Lashkar-e Taiba attack in Mumbai really brought international terrorism to the forefront of the agenda. And it's one of the most significant issues discussed in high-level meetings between the U.S. and the Indians. So what's the relationship like between Afghanistan and Pakistan? Pakistani support of the Afghan Taliban and other groups who threaten to destabilize Afghanistan causes major issues and significant friction between these two countries. And there's concern in Pakistan, as I alluded to earlier, about India's growing influence within Afghanistan. And this influence, as I'll detail in a second, takes a number of forms. But again, this all goes back to that zero-sum game, right? So a gain for India in Afghanistan is seen as a net negative for the Pakistanis. And so this is an antagonistic relationship. It was when Musharraf was in power, and it continues to be today. The federally administered tribal areas, this is the border region in AfPak. Again, like I alluded to, the ungoverned area, although again, I'll say it's alternatively governed. The TTP is active here. And it's about, to give you a sense of what we're working with, it's about the size of Massachusetts and home to over 40 different groups and roughly 45,000 militants. So that's you know, combined with the terrain there, that's probably one of the, if not the most difficult region in the world to work in. And the FATA is a base for a range of groups. As I said there, I think 40 groups. You know, and this covers the entire gamut, right? So there's Uzbeks, Tajiks, Uyghurs, all sorts of Arabs and Africans operating in this area, a lot of whom at one point or another swore fealty to al-Qaeda. These fighters have come from Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, and other places, and they've shared their experience with fighters there. And so there's this ever-expanding base of knowledge of tactics, techniques, and procedures of how to conduct terrorist attacks. I mean, quite frankly, you can learn a lot of this stuff on the internet, right? You can do a Google search. I wouldn't suggest that you do that because you might have the FBI knocking at your door. But you know, you can learn a lot of this stuff online, how to build a bomb, how to do these other things. But there's nothing like firsthand knowledge, right? That tacit knowledge transfer of someone sitting there who's done it, who's made 100, 200 bombs or IEDs and showing you, you know, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, here are the pitfalls. And so there's this transfer of knowledge, there's this learning exchange that's happening between regions. And I'll talk about the militant pipeline in a second to give you an idea of how the West views this threat. And a lot of this comes from the Paul Cruikshank study that I alluded to earlier from, I think it's the New America Foundation. In 2009 alone, between 100 and 150 Westerners traveled to the FATA for training. Now he talks about serious jihadist plots, which he differentiates between less serious, but of the 32 serious terrorist plots against the West between 2004 and 2011, so over that 7-year span, more than half of these had operational or training links to groups in Pakistan. Think about that for a second and let it sink in. U.S. forces are in Afghanistan, but more than half of the links to these serious terrorist plots emanated from Pakistan. Right? So even if everything were lovey-dovey and rosy and Afghanistan was a very safe place, there's still this issue of Pakistan. Frankly, that's why a lot of people talk about it as AfPak, right? They're connected, and you can't really have one without the other. 4 of these occurred in 2010, which is the most since 2004. Some more of the survey findings. Again, the most serious anti-Western plots had clearly defined Pakistani links. 44%, or a little less than half, were directed by Pakistan-based jihadists, and the majority of serious anti-Western plots saw cell members receive some training in Pakistan. So still a very dangerous place. Again, not ungoverned, but alternatively governed. The majority were directed overseas. So these aren't really attacks being planned in the West, against the West. They're being planned elsewhere against the West. 63% of the serious Western plots have clearly defined overseas links. So some policy implications. How do we deal with it? Boots on the ground in Pakistan, it's not an option, nor should it be. I don't think it's a good idea. Some more hawkish policymakers say, that's the place the United States should have went. For reasons too numerous to discuss here today, there's probably a book's worth of material on why it would not be a good idea to send the U.S. military into Pakistan. But the drone attacks continue unabated. In fact, there's research to show that President Obama has actually accelerated the drone campaign beyond what President Bush did. And I think maybe not a lot of people are clear on that. And they think that Bush conducted more drone attacks, but it's actually Obama. And this is part of that whole transition from counterinsurgency to counterterrorism. But still, the U.S. needs a comprehensive strategy to mitigate the safe haven offered in Pakistan, right? So you can't let people operate unmolested, but you can't go in there with boots on the ground. So there's got to be some kind of happy medium, short of the Pakistanis all of a sudden thinking it's in their national interest to crack down, and to the extent that it's even possible that Pakistani forces are capable of stopping a lot of these terrorist groups in the FATA. How to end the insurgency in Afghanistan. Penny, for your thoughts. This is an issue I've been working on for about 10 years, and I think maybe I know less now about how to end the insurgency than I did beforehand. Just a few ideas, though. Negotiating with the Afghan Taliban and other elements of the insurgency, in my opinion, absolutely essential. Sometimes you hear the refrain, and I think it's more of a knee-jerk reaction, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Number one, yes, we do. We have in the past, we do now, we will continue to negotiate with terrorists or insurgents or whatever label you want to slap on the bad guys. But can ANSAF, can the Afghan National Security Forces sustain an effective security presence once ISAF departs? I mean, that's one of the biggest question marks, right? And it's one thing when you watch 60 Minutes and they show these kind of degrading videos of Afghans training, and these guys can't do push-ups, and I think that's kind of selective. That's not representative of Afghan forces across the board by any means. But at the same time, we don't really know because it hasn't happened yet. Afghans that are operating now are doing it with high levels of U.S. support. When the U.S. leaves, we really just don't know how well the security forces are going to hold up, if they're going to break down along ethnic lines, if they're going to give up the fight, join the insurgency, if they're going to prevail and use this training and defeat the Taliban, if there's a further civil war. We just don't know. But the big question, after all the blood and treasure spent in Afghanistan, is will it once again become a safe haven for al-Qaeda and groups of its ilk, right? Will the situation revert back to 2000, 2001? And if so, what does that say about the U.S. effort there? And a lot of people are going to say, well, was it worth it? I'm not here today to answer that question, but it's food for thought. Relationship between Afghanistan and India. India has numerous policy objectives and strategies in Afghanistan, CT, but also trade, energy, spreading regional influence. And India seeks political influence in Afghanistan through a variety of means, so development assistance, investment, military training, and certainly diplomatic initiatives. That's a picture right there of, I think it's an Indian embassy in Kabul that was blown up in an insurgent suicide bombing a few years ago. Pakistan and India, as you guys have probably spoken about these past few days, highly contentious relationship. Two countries have already fought several wars since partition in 47, 65, 71, and then the more limited cargo conflict in 99. Ongoing conflict over Kashmir, but also over a number of other issues. The 2008 Mumbai attacks certainly didn't help the relationship. And I think maybe this doesn't go, it's not discussed as much, but there's extremism on both sides here, right? It's not just Pakistani groups. There are extremist Hindu groups that are, anti-Muslim, and it's a two-sided conflict. It's not just one side attacking the other.